La philosophie des Lumières a transformé le monde humain en profondeur. Des auteurs comme John Locke, Voltaire, Adam Smith, Montesquieu et Thomas Paine ont avancé une défense inédite de la liberté, de la tolérance, de l'usage de la raison humaine, du commerce et de l'égalité devant la loi. Nous avons sans doute l'habitude d'entendre surtout parler de l'influence des Lumières sur le rôle accordé à la science, à la recherche et au savoir, ainsi que de leur influence sur la théorie et la pratique des institutions politiques. Mais cette révolution intellectuelle a eu des effets plus terre-à-terre sur nos vies quotidiennes. La détermination des Lumières à apporter des solutions humaines aux problèmes humains a été couronnée d'un succès spectaculaire. Mon invité pour cet épisode, Steven Pinker, explique à quel point nous sommes plus fortunés que nos ancêtres nous ayant précédés de très peu. Enlightenment philosophy has transformed humanity's world in depth. Writers such as John Locke, Voltaire, Adam Smith, Montesquieu, and Thomas Paine have crafted an unprecedented defense of freedom, tolerance, of the use of human reason, of trade and equal rights under the law. We are perhaps most accustomed to hear of the transformations operated by Enlightenment philosophy on the role enjoyed by science, research, and knowledge, as well as on the theory and practice of political institutions. But this intellectual revolution has had more prosaic effects on our everyday lives. The Enlightenment determination to craft human solutions to human problems has been greeted with spectacular success. My guest for this episode, Steven Pinker, explains how much better off we are than our ancestors in the very recent past. So good evening. I'm delighted to be here with Professor Steven Pinker tonight. Professor, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
You're Johnston Family Professor at Harvard University, where you conduct your research in the Department of Psychology. Your research has covered topics such as cognitive science, linguistics, and evolutionary psychology. And you're the author or editor of many books, including The Language Instinct, which was published in 1994, The Blank Slate in 2002, and The Better Angels of Our Nature in 2011. Your most recent book is Enlightenment Now, which was published just a few months ago now in 2018. And it will be the pretext, so to say, for our conversation today. I want to start with a question about the genesis of this book, because I think I remember having read or heard somewhere, but I couldn't find it when I went to look back for it again. I think I heard somewhere that this book was written pretty much as a reply to some of the reactions you got to your earlier book, Better Angels of Our Nature, because you got some negative reactions to this book. You had argued empirically that, in human groups, among humans, violence had decreased in the past and still in the present was decreasing. And many people probably seem to think it was maybe not so interesting that you had failed to talk about other problems facing humanity, such as poverty, inequality, and so on. So is my memory correct on that point?
It was really more that the same epiphany, the same revelation that led me to write The Better Angels of Our Nature. I went the second time when pondering statistics on measures of human well-being and discovering, to my surprise, that they showed improvement. So I was prompted to write The Better Angels of Our Nature almost 10 years ago, when I came across data sets on rates of death in homicide, rates of death in war, rates of violence against women, rates of violence against children, historical developments like the abolition of slavery, the reduction of capital punishment from being applied to hundreds of crimes to being applied only to murder and then being abolished altogether. So in episode after episode, violence has been in decline over the course of history, continuing up to the present, and no one seems to be aware of it, because as long as the rate of violence has not gone to zero, there'll always be enough incidents to fill the news. And if you get your view of the world from the news, you could think that violence is as common as ever. It's only when you look at data that you can appreciate how it's declined. Well, then when I finished the book, I came across data on extreme poverty, showing that extreme poverty has fallen in the world from about 90% of the population 200 years ago to 10% today. In fact, there's a reduction in about 75% just in the last 30 years in extreme poverty. That
Mm-hmm.
child mortality has declined, maternal mortality has declined, illiteracy has declined, uh, education has increased, democracy overall has increased, and that there was a picture of the world once again that's very different from what you get from the papers that needed
Mm-hmm.
to be known and needed an explanation. And the biggest, the deepest explanation that I could find is that the ideas of the Enlightenment, namely that we can use knowledge to make us better off, can work over time. That it's an idea that flourished in the second half of the 18th century, continuing into the 19th, and we're enjoying its benefits today. In other words, the Enlightenment worked. In fact, uh, the title of my book in France, in French translation, is
Mm-hmm.
Des Lumières.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe we can dwell a bit longer on the many good news that you report in your book. You mentioned a few of them. I don't know which ones you would like to explore in some more detail. Yeah, I don't know if you want me to choose
Well,
or if
sure.
you would.
We can start with life itself. Life expectancy
Mm-hmm.
on Earth for most of human history was around 30. Today, it's 71 worldwide, and
Yeah.
and more than 80 in the developed world. Um, Literacy, most of humanity has been illiterate for most of human history. It used to be that only a privileged few could read and write. Today, 90% of the world under the age of 25 can read and write.
Mm-hmm.
Safety, war used to be pretty much ubiquitous, and the great empires were always at war. Now, big countries don't fight each other anymore. The last great power war was pitted the United States against China in Korea more than 65 years ago. And the rate of death
Mm-hmm.
from all wars has come down since the 1950s. Uh, Happiness has increased in a majority of countries in which you can measure it. Leisure time
Yeah.
increased. And as I mentioned before, poverty has been in quite dramatic decline, a three-quarters reduction just in the last 30 years. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not to say that there are not severe problems. There are severe problems, but there have always been severe problems, and there's also been great progress. And once again, it's progress that you can't really appreciate from reading the news. It's only when you
Mm.
look at data that you see how far we've come.
Yeah. It seems we are not really. Um, I don't know if the word is trained, but we are not really able to, take a step back from the current. I mean, from the news, and realize that the world is not going as bad as it seems to be from the news. So you mentioned these two cognitive biases: the accessibility bias and the negativity bias, which can explain this phenomenon.
Indeed, the human brain uh, estimates probability using its own memory as a shortcut. If I can think of an example of something, I think it's highly common.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so if there was a shark attack yesterday, I think that it's very dangerous to go swimming. If there was a terrorist
Mm.
attack, I assume that rates of killing have gone up. Now, in general, this can be a handy shortcut, but whenever something is in the news simply because it's gory or it's recent or it's dramatic, then it can distort our estimate of how common that event is. Then the other bias that you mentioned, a negativity bias, refers to the fact that we are more we give more thought and more emotion to negative events than to positive events. We dread losses more than we enjoy gains. There are more words for negative emotions than for positive emotions. We uh, remember recent bad events more than recent good events, and so this bias in toward the negative also distorts our view of the world.
So yeah, especially, I mean, maybe including at least maybe a first surprise is that what you said also applies to highly educated people. I don't know if it's especially applicable to highly educated people, but many of them seem that, I mean, for many of them, it seems that they don't like to hear about progress. They don't really like to hear the data that you're presenting. It seems that to many people, talk of progress is perhaps naive. Maybe they think it sounds a bit foolish. There is maybe this sense that if one talks about crisis or at least decay, it's more profound, more responsible, more respectable, perhaps.
Indeed, I think you've identified a third reason why people are, I think, irrationally cynical or fatalistic or pessimistic about the world, that it seems naive to acknowledge what's gone right, especially if you're an intellectual and you see your role as standing outside the institutions of society, criticizing them, pointing out injustices. If you point out what's going right, then people think that's being complicit with the establishment, with being a defender of the status quo. Now, it's essential to criticize injustice and corruption wherever it occurs. But I argue that it's also important to acknowledge the successes of our institutions. For one thing, just for the sake of accuracy, if poverty has decreased worldwide, we should know about it. But also in order to appreciate what is praiseworthy about our institutions, that for all the flaws of liberal democracy, it's a whole lot better than fascism. It's better than Maoist dictatorships. It's better than strongman dictatorships. And we should appreciate what goes right, I argue, or else we might end up with something a lot worse than what we have.
You also discuss specifically in the book and elsewhere in your discussions of the book in some media, the surprising, I don't know if it's surprising, but at least at face value, it's a bit surprising that people who might consider themselves progressive, so to say, politically and philosophically, seem not to be very enthused with what you present, the evidence of progress that has actually happened.
Yes, as I say, progressives hate progress. I think it's because they see themselves as outside of society. They see their role as attacking our existing political institutions. And one way of thinking about it is that society has different elites. There are intellectuals, there are business people, there are people in technology, there are people in government, people in the military, people in the church. And they're always in rivalry as to who deserves the most credit for what's taking place. And intellectuals attack society. It's also a way of attacking the businessmen and the politicians. For the same reason that often businessmen will talk about what's going wrong so that they can attack the politicians. Everyone has an incentive to criticize society because it's a way of criticizing their professional rivals.
I see. You also mentioned towards the end of the book the fact that many intellectuals throughout, especially the 20th century, but up until now, I suppose, have had some sympathies for some very authoritarian and even dictatorial regimes. And so you bring up this possible hypothesis, which I think resonates with what you just mentioned, which is that maybe intellectuals feel underappreciated in liberal democracies. They might prefer the dictators that try to implement their favorite worldview, meaning the worldview of the intellectuals, to the process of liberal democracies where everyone has their own say, and including people the intellectuals might not see as very educated or intelligent.
Indeed, and this was a point that was first made by a French intellectual, I think Julien Banda, des clercs, the treason intellectuals, back in the 1920s. And he pointed to a strange phenomenon, which is that every dictator of the 20th century has had fans among intellectuals. Stalin, Mao, Castro, the Ayatollah Khomeini, all of them had Western intellectuals in praising them and looking up to them, which you'd think it would be a paradox because intellectuals are supposed to speak truth to power, and they're very proud of opposing the political establishment of their own countries. But in history, they have often praised some of the most murderous dictators in the world, including Hitler. Hitler had supporters among intellectuals, and he did identify some of the reasons. Often dictators, because they run their societies from the top down instead of letting people live the lives as they wish, they naturally appoint court intellectuals and impose theories as to how society should run, whereas democracies often empower people to make their own decisions. They are run by not just by votes, but a market economy, for example, runs by hundreds of millions of people deciding for themselves what to buy and sell. A language is, despite the Académie Française, in reality, languages are not legislated by a committee. They just arise as people speak with one another and shape the language unconsciously. And that form of organization, where you have distributed intelligence across hundreds of millions of people, no one's in charge, no one lays down a step-by-step argument as to how it should work, but people just interact and live their lives, and order emerges. That often is different from the way intellectuals like to organize their worlds.
So it's actually probably a good transition. I mean, at least the fact that you mentioned the free market, which is very decentralized, and to which intellectuals have often been hostile. One of the key points, I guess, of the book is that you emphasize how much free trade has been instrumental in progress. But there is indeed quite a bit of hostility in the intellectual class towards commerce and trade, and there has been for quite a while. One can think back of the 19th century German philosophers who saw it as mediocre and very far removed from the ideals of heroism. I suppose one could put it this way. So there is really this hostility from an important part of the intellectual class to the mechanism that has brought about so much improvement in the world, namely free trade.
Indeed, I mean, markets have aroused hostility from religious thinkers for thousands of years, going back to the Bible, from military classes, from intellectual classes, although a big theme of the Enlightenment was the notion of du commerce, gentle, that because economic exchange involves voluntary cooperation that makes both sides better off, otherwise they would never agree to the exchange, it can be a positive force in human life, not just in increasing prosperity and wealth, though it does that, but also in discouraging war and plunder and theft. Because if it's cheaper to buy something than to steal it, then in a market, you're much more encouraged to engage in commerce than to engage in warfare. This is an idea that was promoted, of course, by Adam Smith, but also by Montesquieu, by Voltaire, by the American founders like Hamilton. And it's an idea that has been vindicated by recent studies that show that countries that engage in more trade are less likely to go to war. But again, this is an idea that is very unpopular in much of intellectual life, which just like religious prophets, just like the military caste, look down on commerce as something that is selfish, that's venal, that's tawdry, that has no class. During the Enlightenment, it was often praised.
Yeah, this is something I've noticed that at least if I, maybe my memories from my school years are wrong, but I seem to remember that we're taught about the Enlightenment thinkers, and of course, it's an important feature of the intellectual history and political history of France. It was not really emphasized at all that Voltaire and some of his colleagues were very much in favor of free trade. This is something that, as far as I can recall, was not emphasized at all. So one of the main, I think, objections that people have leveled at, I mean, still to your most recent book, Enlightenment Now, is about inequality, even though you devote to it one of the longest chapters of the book. But this is a recurrent objection, people saying that things have not improved so much because there is still so much inequality in the world. And here we can quote, as you did in your book, Thomas Piketty, the French economist, who says that the poorer half of the population are as poor today as they were in the past, with barely 5% of total wealth in 2010, just as in 1910. So in this view, their lot hasn't improved at all, the lot of the poorer half of the world's population. So what is your reply to that?
I mean, it's a surprising thing for Piketty to say, because it's an error. I assume he was just being careless. But of course, if the total amount of wealth is much bigger today, then even if the poor had only 5% of it, they would not be as poor. They would be much, much richer, because it would be 5% of a much bigger number. But people do use two issues, at least two issues. One of them is poverty, which of course is a major concern for anyone who is interested in human well-being. But poverty is not the same thing as inequality. That poverty refers to how well the poor live their lives. Are they healthy? Do their children get an education? Do their children survive? Can they afford clothing? Can they afford food? And inequality is how big is the gap between the poor and the rich. And those, as long as there isn't a single lump of wealth that is divided up so that if some people get more, other people must get less, then poverty and inequality are not the same thing. And I agree that we must be concerned with poverty. Now, that may require measures such as progressive taxation, that is, a higher tax rate for rich people than for poor people. That is obviously justified. And it will have an effect of reducing inequality if some of the taxation goes to social spending, to welfare, education, to healthcare. But the goal isn't to reduce the gap. The goal is to improve the lives of people at the bottom.
So you
and
have,
I should add,
please go ahead.
Inequality between countries has actually been decreasing.
Yes.
Poor countries have been getting richer faster than rich countries are getting richer. So on the world stage, comparing one country with another, then actually inequality has gone up within rich countries.
Yeah, you have a pretty long discussion of inequality in Western countries, I guess we could call them, because here the picture is not so clear. Maybe, I mean, you point out the fact that maybe the people who have benefited relatively less from recent developments in, I guess, economics especially, are the lower middle classes of the industrialized countries. There is this famous curve, maybe you can discuss it, the elephant from Milanovic. And so you discuss in quite some detail the relationship between inequality and unhappiness, because, you have just argued that what's important is not so much inequality as the actual wealth that people have, even if they are relatively poorer than other people. But some people, or many people, many intellectuals argue that even in a rich society, if you are at the losing end of some inequalities, you will have your quality of life suffering. So maybe you can discuss this point.
Yes, there is there were studies that suggested that inequality was a big contributor to social pathology, to depression, to crime, to drug addiction, to unhappiness. But it's not easy to do those studies because countries that are more equal also tend to be wealthier. Say Denmark or Germany, France, Norway. Uh, Countries that are unequal, like South Africa, are also poorer. And many other things go together with inequality and with poverty, such as education, such as women's rights. There are lots and lots of things that go together in a successful country like Sweden, and a lot of things that go together in unsuccessful countries like Afghanistan, Somalia. So it's not so easy to tease them apart. And the most recent study and largest study that I have found shows that wealth is much more important than equality. People in countries that are rich but unequal, like Hong Kong and Singapore, are actually do pretty well, and that people in countries that are more equal but poorer don't do as well. Uh, the other new finding is that what really gets people upset is not so much inequality as unfairness. If they think that the rules are rigged against them and that the wealthy people get ahead because they've cheated, that's what makes people angry. If they think that the rules are fair and that some people are luckier, some people are more talented, some people work harder, then they're fine with inequality.
Okay. Maybe we could move on to the environment, which is also one of the longest chapters in the book. I'm sure you were anticipating quite a lot of pushback on that point because it's hard to argue that there can be, or there has been, in some respects at least, some improvement on that front. And it's also, after the release of the book, it was clearly one of the points on which you were most consistently, attacked maybe is a bit of a strong word, but, on which you faced most opposition. So, of course, one can point to all the improvements that humanity has achieved, but still be very concerned, and one should be very concerned about the change in the global climate. Would you say that? I mean, I have, I guess, two questions. My first question is: would you say it's the biggest challenge right now in this early 21st century? And would you say perhaps it's the biggest challenge so far? I mean, in the whole history of humanity?
Certainly, I would identify climate change as our biggest challenge. And there, would not say that we've made progress. We have not carbon emissions.
Yeah.
Carbon emissions flattened out in the year 2016, but they've risen again. And and even if they stayed the same, that's not what needs to avoid the potential for catastrophe. It has to go to zero. I think that we should look at solutions to the challenge of climate change. That is, developing abundant sources of carbon-free energy, and eventually figure out how to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And that we shouldn't see it as a cosmic punishment or payback or a guaranteed apocalypse, but should work very hard toward the combination of policy and technology that would deal with the problem. Aspects of the environment, some of them have gotten much worse, but others have gotten better. As when countries get richer, they can afford the energy and convenience they want with less pollution. That is, technologies for reducing emissions become more affordable. People are more willing to pay for them when their countries get richer. And also, people's values change when they get richer. If you don't have electricity, if you're just living in a village and you've got to burn charcoal or dung in your house in order to cook, then the last thing you care about is the atmosphere. You're much more concerned with being able to cook your food and heat your home and get to school. But as societies get wealthier, their values change and they put more of a premium on the environment. And that we see that happening in Western countries that have cleaned up their rivers, the Seine, the Thames, the Charles, the Hudson, that have started to clean up the atmosphere. The amount of smog has decreased in most Western cities. A number of species have been rescued. So it's not as if all aspects of the environment have gotten worse and worse and worse. And when societies get richer, they start to deal with environmental problems. Now, again, that is not, so far, we have not dealt with climate, with greenhouse gas emissions. And I do think that that is an imperative, and I don't want to claim that we have made progress on that. We have not.
Yeah, it's quite clear in the book. Well, maybe this is the point where I should bring in the current American administration, because you write at some point in the book that some of your colleagues who maybe helped you proofread some chapters urged you to write, perhaps at the end of every single chapter, that this specific progress is threatened by the current American administration, and probably you would argue that this is mostly the case for what we just discussed, namely the environment. But I don't know exactly when you were writing these specific chapters, but I guess now we are almost halfway through at least the first mandate of President Trump. What do you see as being the the grade that you would give this administration on this very hot topic, the biggest challenge of them all, of global warming?
Yes, well, it's terrible. Even if you believe in progress, you don't believe it's taking place everywhere all the time, and there have undoubtedly been setbacks within the United States and in to the world that have elected populist leaders. So most obviously, Donald Trump has planned to pull the United States out of the Paris Climate Agreement, and he's tried to undo environmental regulations that have succeeded in reducing air pollution and water pollution. He has undermined global trade, which has contributed both to prosperity and to peace. He has proposed dismantling the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty, which has helped bring down the number of nuclear weapons, and has promised to engage in a new nuclear arms race. He has praised dictators while criticizing leaders, so he has not done much toward the spread of democracy. So yes, it's been almost exclusively negative, and I did mention in the book that you cannot take progress for granted. It depends on embracing Enlightenment ideals such as science and reason and humanism and liberal institutions of global cooperation. If people walk away from the Enlightenment ideals, then things could get worse. There's no guarantee that things will get better.
So one of the phenomena that is perhaps the most frustrating to people who are attached to the Enlightenment ideals is when large numbers of people start believing in patently false narratives or patently false beliefs. Of course, we can just mention, disbelief in man-made global warming. We just went over that topic. We could also mention denial of evolution. I guess, well, in France these days we have severe problems with acceptance of vaccines as helpful and useful. But you write at some point in the book that the scientists' sort of first reflex when faced these phenomena is to think that people should just hear more of the science, perhaps be more educated, have more scientists speak in the main media outlets, but that you are now not so sanguine about the possibility of these things helping dispel false beliefs, and you write that probably better explanations for false beliefs than just ignorance might be tribalism and the adherence to the beliefs of one's tribal group.
Indeed, the research by Daniel Kahan, a lawyer at Yale, has shown that people who accept evolution and climate change are not more scientifically knowledgeable than people who deny it.
Mm-hmm.
Of them believe in utterly false things. For example, some people who believe in climate change say that we need to fix it for cleaning toxic waste dumps. They have a vision
Mm,
of green and versus pollution, but don't understand.
yeah.
Um, what predicts people's opinions on evolution and climate change is just their politics. The farther you are to the right, the more you reject evolution and man-made climate change. So the way to get people to appreciate the scientific consensus is not by giving them more science, but it's in decoupling their beliefs on scientific issues from their politics. And as long as people say that to believe in climate change on the left, then anyone on the right is going to reject climate change.
Mm-hmm. And are there, I mean, do people have any ideas how to do that, to operate this
It's
decoupling?
not easy. I mean, one of them is
Yeah.
to make sure that one doesn't accidentally unite a
Mm,
scientific issue with a political ideology. And in that regard, there are some people who say that the worst thing that happened to climate awareness was when Al Gore made an inconvenient truth, because
mm-hmm.
it turned climate change into a left wing issue. Um, so finding people who are libertarians, who are on the right, who accept the science would be an important step. Another one may be to decouple a scientific hypothesis, such as that human activity has been warming the climate, from the solutions that people propose to it. So if you say that because of human made climate change, we have to stop economic growth, to uh, reverse economic progress and go back to a simpler and more rural lifestyle, we've got to um, forego comforts and luxuries and do without electricity, then people will say, well, if that's what we have to do if the climate is changing, then I don't believe the climate is changing. Now, of course, that's irrational, but that's the way people respond. If
Mm,
you say, well, there is this fact of human-made climate change, how can we deal with it? And the solutions include things like nuclear power. Here, France has been a world leader, at least so far,
mhm.
or even climate engineering, that is trying to change the climate with other man-made interventions. Whether or not it's a good idea, I, it probably is not. But even putting them on the table and telling people that there may be ways of dealing with climate change other than stopping economic growth makes them more receptive to the very idea that there has been human made climate change. So a lot of it depends on communication, on depoliticizing and demoralizing
Mhm.
the issues so that people can accept the facts without their identity being challenged.
Mhm. This is also what you try to do on a completely different topic in your book, The Blank Slate, when you try to, explain that one can accept the evidence of differences between people not being only due to life circumstances, but also due to innate, so to say, characteristics to some extent, at least in part. One can accept that without sort of, I guess, fetishizing those differences or, giving them a moral, um, dimension characteristic. So,
Exactly. Yes.
yeah, this is also something you had discussed.
Yes. I argue that we should be very clear on what is a moral issue and what is a factual issue, and
Mm-hmm.
try to distort the facts to allow us to engage in lazy politics or lazy moralizing. And an example of gender differences is a prime example. I think there are many people who want to insist that men and women are exactly the same because they think that that is the best argument for women's rights and for feminism. That and I think that's a big mistake. That the issue of women's equality is a political and moral issue. it doesn't depend on men and women being identical. It depends on elementary notions of fairness.
So, yeah, my last question concerns, well, the history and the present of the idea of enlightenment. So, I guess one could argue that the initial wave of enlightenment thinking had as one of its main foes, if not its main foe, the the reality of organized religion and the power it wielded back in the days. Could we say, given what we discussed, I mean, it can be on the point of climate change, it can be on differences between men and women, it can be on many points, we see that it's not so much people's religious beliefs that are driving what they are ready to accept from the scientific evidence, but it's mostly their political beliefs these days. So would you say that, the Enlightenment has broadly defeated religious dogmatism, but that it still has to overcome political dogmatism today?
Yes, and I don't think it has successfly overcome religious dogmatism.
Yeah.
in parts of the world where everyone is still highly religious, the global trend is for the influence of religion to decline. That's partly counteracted by the fact that religious people have more babies, so they make more religious people, even though among those people who change their view, they're much more likely to move away from religion than toward it. All religions themselves have partly been changing. The Catholic Church with the Second Ecumenical Council, the liberalization of many Protestant denominations, the rise of humanistic and reform and liberal Judaism, are just examples of how, under the influence of the Enlightenment, many religions have changed. But you're right that among many people today, the politics of the left and the right have taken the place of religion in giving them a moral system, a set of saints and devils, reason for living, a way of having an opinion on all issues. And I do think it's a problem that people have become so identified with a political tribe, be it on the left or the right, that they no longer are receptive to arguments and evidence on the particular issues that go into them.
Yeah, well, this is very much one of the main points that concern us on our podcast. So it's a nice way to end the discussion. I want to thank you again, Professor Pinker. Thank you very much for agreeing to come and talk to us.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I hope your book does as well as it deserves in France.
Thank you. I will be in France in the first week in November.
Okay, sounds great. I mean, myself, I live in Germany, but yeah.
Okay. Nice to have a conversation with you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Have a nice day.
You too. Bye.